In the late afternoon of a Swiss autumn day, sometime in the early 1880s, a boy sat alone near the edge of a field outside Keswill on the southern shore of Lake Constance, where the light came down flat and pale across the grass, and the air held the particular stillness that arrives in the hour before a family calls for supper. He was not especially old, somewhere between 8 and 10, and to anyone watching from the farmhouse window, he would have appeared simply to be sitting in the way children sometimes sit when they have no particular reason to move. But something interior was happening that the posture gave no sign of. Two selves were present in that field. One of them had been to school that day, had answered when spoken to, had worn the right face at the right moments, had belonged in the ordinary and necessary way to the world of other people. The other, older somehow, heavier and strangely calm, belonged to no school, no village, no particular century. It looked out from behind the first self, the way a deeper country lies behind a foreground hill, felt rather than seen, present rather than demonstrated. The boy's name was Carl Gustav Jung, and he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand what had been in that field with him, not in the way of someone haunted, not with urgency or alarm. He would sit with it the way he had learned, already in those early years, to sit with the lake and the changing light and the stone walls that had been built by hands, now generations gone, with the quiet, patient attention of someone who suspects that what is most important tends to reveal itself gradually and only to those willing to remain with it past the point of comfort. He called these two presences personality number 1 and personality number 2. The names are clinical in sound, but the experience they point to was nothing like a clinical finding. It was more like living inside a house where two distinct kinds of knowing occupied different rooms, one bright, social, contemporary, and perfectly legible to the people around him, one old, interior, and difficult to translate into the language anyone nearby was using. What he came to understand, and this understanding would take decades, not years, was that the division he had felt in that field was not a personal peculiarity. It was not the sign of something gone wrong in one particular Swiss boy. It was the beginning of a map of consciousness that, once drawn carefully enough, would turn out to apply to everyone. The shadow is not a wound. That is perhaps the first thing to know about it, and perhaps the hardest thing to hold on to once the word has been introduced, because the language of darkness tends to pull the mind toward damage and diagnosis, toward the idea that something has failed and must be repaired. But what Jung encountered in himself, and what he would spend his professional life working to articulate, was more structural than that, more fundamental. It was the inevitable shape of a conscious mind embedded in a social world, the consequence not of something having gone wrong, but of the ordinary, necessary process of a self coming into being at all. There is a village outside Keswill, and it is the late 19th century, and a boy sits in a field. The light does not carry an explanation, but it carries the thing that much later will become one. Jung's mother was moody, gifted, and inconsistent, a woman whose inner life seemed to have more rooms than her outer life ever fully expressed. His father was a Protestant minister whose faith had dried to something obligatory and hollow by the time his son was old enough to notice. The household was educated, rural, slightly melancholy, and full of the particular atmosphere that gathers when intelligent people are not saying the most important things. Jung noticed all of this, not as a catalogue of grievances. As a reader notices the weather in a book, it shapes everything, it is everywhere, and it does not always have to be named to be felt. From this early environment came his first serious question, the one that underlay everything else. What is actually happening in the interior of a human being, and how much of it does the person themselves know about? The boy who sat in the field knew that his two presences were real. He also knew, with the instinctive sociological intelligence children develop long before they have words for it, that mentioning the second one would accomplish nothing good. Personality. No two was not something Keswell had a place for, so it was carried privately, turned over in private, taken out in the late afternoon light when no one was watching, and then carefully packed away again when supper was called. This early arrangement, the carrying of an interior life that cannot be fully presented to the exterior world, is not the shadow itself, but it is the seed of the question the shadow grows from. What gets packed away when the self meets the world? What is held back, and why? And what happens to it in the holding? Decades before Jung had arrived at any answer, Friedrich Nietzsche had been asking something adjacent to the same question, with the specific intensity of a mind that pushed every idea to its absolute edge. In the high alpine village of Sils Maria, in the early 1880s, the same years Jung was sitting in Swiss fields carrying his two selves, Nietzsche was writing by lamplight in the severe and clarifying cold of the mountains, articulating something that would find its way into philosophical history under the names Apollo and Dionysus. The argument was roughly this, that civilization requires the imposition of order, form, and rational control, the Apollonian, over the raw, chaotic, ecstatic energy of life, the Dionysian, and that this imposition is both necessary and dangerous. Necessary because without order, social life cannot be sustained. Dangerous because what is suppressed does not disappear. It gathers in the dark with the patience of something that has nowhere else to go. And when it finally erupts, as it always eventually does, the scale of the eruption tends to be proportional to the length and thoroughness of the suppression. Nietzsche was writing philosophy. Jung would eventually translate the same insight into psychology, giving it a different vocabulary and a different set of clinical observations. But the recognition underneath was the same, that the ordering principle of a mind or a culture necessarily creates a shadow, and that shadow is made of everything the ordering principle required be kept out of sight. Nietzsche did not use the word shadow. He did not need to. The idea was already present in the structure of his argument, in the way Zarathustra descends from the mountain, only to find that the valley below him is full of people who cannot tolerate the truths he has carried down. What they cannot tolerate, the darkness, the instinct, the unmanageable vitality underneath the civilized surface, does not cease to exist because they have turned away from it. It simply stops having a name. And things without names do not become less real. They become less visible, which is not the same thing at all. Jung read Nietzsche. He read him with the careful, troubled attention of someone who recognizes an argument that is going to be demanding to live with, who can already see that the idea, if followed seriously, leads somewhere the comfortable assumptions of his professional world were not going to accommodate easily. He was already in Vienna by then, already working within the structure of early psychoanalysis, already in the presence of Freud, and the conversation between those two men, which would eventually end in a break neither of them seems to have wanted, but neither could finally prevent, is itself a kind of illustration of the very principle they were trying to describe. The first meeting between Freud and Jung took place in Vienna in 1907. Two men, an apartment at Berggasse 19, a conversation that by various accounts lasted 13 hours. There is something worth pausing at in that detail. 13 hours of continuous thought, the two of them building something together that neither of them could yet see whole, finding in the other's mind the kind of answering intelligence that comes rarely, and when it comes, tends to produce both exhilaration and the first seeds of future disagreement. They agreed on the fundamental importance of the unconscious. They agreed that the hidden interior of the mind was not some minor annex to the real business of consciousness, but the territory where most of what actually determined human behavior took place, largely out of reach of the person it was happening to. What they did not agree on, and the disagreement would take years to fully articulate, years in which both men moved carefully around the fault line without naming it, was the nature of that hidden interior. For Freud, the unconscious was primarily a reservoir of repressed drives, most importantly, sexual and aggressive, accumulated through the experience of a single lifetime, the turbulent residue of a life forced to fit itself into the constraints of civilization. This was a serious and consequential view. It had already produced genuinely significant findings. It explained a great deal, but for Jung, it was not enough. Or rather, it explained less than it seemed to, because beneath the personal repressions of any individual life, something else appeared to be present, something that did not originate in the experience of that individual at all. His patients brought him dreams populated by figures and symbols they had no conscious knowledge of, mythological motifs, ancient images, patterns of narrative, and symbol that appeared in cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, turning up with a regularity that could not be accounted for by personal history alone. A farmer's wife in Zurich was not drawing on Egyptian cosmology when she described the movement of the sun through her dream, but the image she described was there in the Egyptian material in forms that predated her by 3,000 years. Something was being transmitted, not through books or conscious learning, through something deeper and more structural, what Jung would come to call the collective unconscious, a stratum of the psyche that underlies the personal shared across the species, inherited in the way that architecture of the body is inherited, populated by structural patterns of psychological experience he called archetypes. The shadow, in Jung's full understanding, is one of these archetypes, not merely the accumulation of an individual's personal repressions, though it carries those too, but a universal structural feature of human consciousness itself. The aspect of the psyche that holds what the conscious self has not claimed, cannot claim, or has been forbidden to claim by the culture in which it developed. The split with Freud was formalized by 1913. It was the end of a collaboration that had been, for a period, one of the most generative intellectual relationships either man would know. It was also, in its way, entirely inevitable, not because one of them was wrong in a simple sense, but because the territories they were mapping were genuinely different, and the difference had philosophical consequences neither man could agree to set aside. Jung's unconscious was transpersonal, spiritual in the broadest sense of that word, oriented not merely toward the relief of symptoms, but toward what he would later call the individuation of the person, the long developmental process of moving toward psychological wholeness. Freud's project was in some sense smaller than this, and in another sense more modest, which is perhaps not the same as being smaller. For Jung, the break was not without cost, but the cost is not the most important thing about it. The most important thing is what he did with the space that opened up after it. In the winter of 1913, Jung was alone. The professional alliance that had structured so much of his intellectual life was dissolved. He was in his late 30s, established in Zurich, married, practicing, successful in the external sense, and confronted with an interior situation that all of that success could not resolve. The unconscious was pressing against the edges of his daily awareness with an insistence he could no longer manage by ordinary means. He had studied it, theorized it, mapped its terrain in his patients, but he had not, in any full or deliberate sense, descended into it himself. He began that winter, at his home in Kusnacht, in the specific stillness of his study, the lamplight on the desk, the winter dark outside the windows, the particular quality of silence that belongs to a house where everyone else has gone to sleep. He sat down and did something that had no professional precedent to recommend it, and some danger attached to it. He let the images come. He followed them deliberately, not as a passive observer, but as a willing participant, maintaining enough of his own perspective to record what he found without being entirely absorbed by it. He kept notebooks, he painted, he wrote in a form that was neither clinical nor literary, but partook of both. The record of this period would eventually become a work called the Red Book, a vast illuminated manuscript of the unconscious, kept private for most of his lifetime, not published until long after his death. What he found in those pages was not comfort, but it was not chaos either. It was the beginning of a map. Figures appeared that were not him, or not only him, figures that argued with him, challenged him, offered him things he did not entirely understand, refused to behave as projections of his own mind, because they seemed to know things his conscious self had not yet acknowledged. A wise old man, a young woman, a serpent, a dwarf, a landscape of the interior that followed its own laws and rewarded the traveler who came without too firm a set of expectations about what would be found. This was not, Jung would later insist, poetry or hallucination. It was the unconscious doing what the unconscious does when given the conditions in which to do it, dramatizing, in the language of image and symbol, the psychological situation of the person attending to it. What the conscious mind cannot or will not say directly, the unconscious tends to say in forms that require interpretation, but are not on that account less real or less true. Individuation. The word Jung eventually settled on for the central developmental project of a human life describes the long, patient, often difficult process of moving toward a more complete version of oneself by bringing unconscious contents into conscious awareness. The shadow is not the whole of this project, but it is, as Jung would say again and again, across decades of writing and clinical practice, its first and most demanding stage. What makes it demanding is not the darkness in itself. Darkness can be named, examined, sat with, slowly understood. What makes it demanding is the resistance, the ways in which the conscious self, having spent years constructing a particular image of itself, encounters the shadow not as an invitation to greater wholeness, but as a threat to the stability of everything that image was built to protect. To own the shadow is not to become it. This is perhaps the most common misunderstanding, and the one that most reliably prevents people from beginning. Owning the shadow means acknowledging that the qualities one has most thoroughly disowned, the rage, the envy, the fear, the selfishness, the capacity for cruelty that civilization's long training teaches every person to locate in others and never in oneself, are present, have always been present, and will not become less dangerous for being unacknowledged. They will become more dangerous. Unacknowledged things have no consciousness attached to them. They operate from beneath the threshold of awareness, shaping behavior and relationship and choice in ways the person experiencing them is genuinely unable to see. The mandala was one of the forms that appeared in Jung's own descent and in the dreams and artwork of his patients. The word comes from Sanskrit, meaning roughly circle, and the form itself, concentric rings, fourfold symmetry, a center toward which all the geometry tends. appears independently across cultures, in Buddhist and Hindu traditions, in the sand paintings of Navajo ceremonial practice, in the rose windows of medieval European cathedrals, in the spontaneous drawings of patients who had never been introduced to any of these traditions. Jung took the mandala seriously as a psychological document, not as proof of anything metaphysical, but as evidence that the psyche, when it begins to work toward integration, tends to reach for a form that holds opposites within a single bounded space. The mandala does not resolve the tension between the light and the dark. It holds them both. It makes room for both within a single circle that has a center. This is not a small idea, and Jung knew it was not a small idea. The whole weight of Western psychology up to his moment had been oriented broadly toward the relief of suffering, the elimination of symptoms, the restoration of function, the return to what counted as normal. What Jung was proposing was something further and more demanding, that the normal self, the well-functioning, symptom-free self that ordinary psychology aimed to restore, might itself be incomplete in a way that required attending to. That beneath the ordinary competence of a socially adapted life lay a larger, stranger, more complete version of the person, one that could only be reached by going through what had been left behind. The boy in the field outside Keswill had two selves. The adult Jung, sitting in the lamplight of Kusnacht 40 years later, was trying to find a way to describe that experience with enough precision that it might become useful, not just to himself, but to the many people he was coming to believe carried the same interior doubling, for the same reasons, in the same silence. The reasons, as he came to understand them, had nothing personal about them at all. Every self, in coming into being, must negotiate a relationship with the world it is being born into. That world has requirements. It has ideas about what is acceptable and what is not, what is welcome and what must be put away, what deserves encouragement and what produces silence or disapproval. The negotiation between the individual and the social world is not optional. It is the very process by which a self becomes legible to itself and to others. But the negotiation has a cost, and the cost is structural. What gets filed away in the negotiation, not destroyed, not eliminated, but placed somewhere out of daily reach, is what becomes the shadow. In this sense, the shadow is not a pathology. It is the mark of having become a person in a social world. Every person carries it. The question is not whether one has a shadow. The question is what relationship one will have with it, whether it will be ignored and therefore grow autonomous and unmanageable, or whether it will be turned toward, carefully, with the patient and somewhat uncomfortable honesty that genuine self-knowledge tends to require. Nietzsche, in Sels Maria, writing by lamplight, articulating the underground of everything civilization, Barrie's his particular form of the work was philosophical, lived through the very language he was building, and it tended to arrive at formulations so extreme they could only be held by someone with exceptional reserves of philosophical discipline. Jung, in Kusnacht, in the winter of 1913, beginning the long descent that would eventually become the Red Book. His form of the work was more personal, more patient, more oriented toward what could be brought back and used. Both of them were working with the same underlying recognition that the human self contains more than the social self can express, and that the excess does not simply disappear because it has been asked to be quiet. The Freud split, held at the distance of history, looks less like a tragedy and more like the natural consequence of two serious minds following the same initial observation to genuinely different conclusions. Freud followed his observation toward the personal, the biographical, the concrete mechanics of repression and sublimation within a single human life. Jung followed his toward the transpersonal, the archetypal, the patterns that repeated across cultures and centuries with a consistency that could not be explained by individual history alone. Neither path was more correct in any simple sense. Both produced genuine knowledge. The argument between them is still going. The interesting thing is that the argument itself, the fault line along which they divided, runs through the middle of the question they had both started with, which was simply, what is the human interior, and how much of it do we actually know? The answer, from both sides of that fault line, was the same: less than we think, less than we would prefer. And the work of knowing it more fully, uncomfortable, patient, honest work, is not the sort of work that has an endpoint or a final resolution. It is, as Jung would say, in a different register later in his life, the work of a lifetime. The mandala on the desk is not a finished circle. Its geometry is organized toward a center, and the center holds. But what it holds is tension, not resolution. The opposites, dark and light, known and unknown, the self that goes to school and the self that belongs to something older and harder to name, are present within it, simultaneously, related, contained, but not collapsed into each other. That is not completion. It is the ongoing patient form that approaching completion takes, in a life lived with sufficient honesty and sufficient willingness to remain with what is difficult. In the field outside Keswill, the light is going. The afternoon has come to its end. Supper will be called, and the boy who sits in the grass will stand up and go inside, and the face he wears through the evening meal will be the right face for the occasion, the social face, warm enough, present enough, belonging in the way the occasion requires belonging, personality. Number 1. Carrying as he goes the quiet, slightly formal knowledge that personality number 2 has been waiting in the field and will be waiting still in the morning. Neither of these selves cancels the other out. That is the thing. Neither of them, despite the temptation to think otherwise, represents the true self, while the other is merely performance. They are both real. They are both present. And the fact that one of them is harder to present to the world, older, stranger, less easily translated into the language of schoolyards and dinner tables, does not make it less a part of what the boy is, or less a part of what in time the man he becomes will have to find a way to honor. This is what the shadow finally is, stripped of its more theatrical associations. Not a monster, not a catastrophe waiting to happen, not the worst of what a person is, kept out of sight by the social conventions that prevent everyone from acting on their most destructive impulses. The shadow is the full remainder. Everything the self, in the long negotiation with the social world, was asked to set aside. It holds certainly the difficult things, the anger, the envy, the selfishness, the fear masquerading as contempt, but it holds other things too, things that are not dark at all, vitality that was too loud for the room, creativity that did not fit the expected shape, a quality of aliveness that the formation of the social self required be kept, for now somewhere out of reach. What turning toward the shadow begins, and what Jung spent his life trying to describe, and what the long history of psychology and philosophy and mythology has in its various vocabularies been working toward without always having this particular set of words for it, is not the difficult work of confronting one's worst self. It is the more spacious work of acknowledging one's full self, the whole of it, the part that sat at the dinner table and the part that sat in the field, the self that is legible to the social world and the self that belongs to something older, quieter, more difficult to name. That recognition that the shadow is not a wound, but a companion, not a diagnosis, but an inheritance, not a crisis, but the beginning of an honest accounting, is not arrived at quickly, and it is not held without effort once arrived at, but it can be arrived at. It has been, by careful and honest thinkers in every tradition that has thought carefully and honestly about the interior of human experience. Jung arrived at it, and the version of it he arrived at, forged in the specific crucible of his own divided interior and tested against decades of clinical observation and comparative study, is one of the most useful maps of the interior landscape that the past 100 years of serious inquiry has produced. The boy in the field is standing now, brushing the grass from his jacket, walking back toward the farmhouse where the windows have begun to glow with evening light. Both of his selves are going inside. Both of them will sit at the table. Only one of them will speak, but the other one is present, and has always been present, and turning toward it, not today, perhaps not for years, but eventually, with the kind of calm and unhurried honesty that belongs to someone who has stopped pretending the field is empty, is not an act of despair or difficulty or defeat. It is the beginning of an honest and more spacious life, one that has room in it for all of what a person is, one that stops spending its energy in the maintenance of the illusion that the field behind the farmhouse is empty, and begins instead to sit with what is actually there, learning its shape, learning its nature, finding that the darkness, when sat with long enough and honestly enough, turns out to be less a darkness than a depth, something old, something real, something that has been waiting without urgency and without reproach for exactly as long as it has been kept waiting. The light across the Swiss countryside is low and pale. The lake is somewhere in the distance, holding its own quiet surface. The evening is beginning in the way evenings begin in places that have not yet been asked to hurry, and in the field, which is now empty, the late afternoon light rests on the grass for a little while longer, patient and unhurried and asking nothing at all. At a family dinner table, somewhere in the middle of the last century, a child discovered something she could not have named and would not name for decades, and which was nonetheless already doing its quiet work inside her. She had laughed too loudly at something. She could not remember afterward exactly what the laughter was about, only that it had risen out of her like water from a cracked pipe, uncontrolled and genuine, and that the adult faces around the table had shifted in a particular way, not cruelly, not with raised voices. The shift was smaller than that, and more permanent, a slight cooling, a brief flicker of a particular kind of attention, the kind that evaluates rather than receives. And then the meal went on, the conversation resumed, and no one said anything at all about the laughter that had been too large. But something had already happened. Something had rearranged itself, quietly and without drama, in the interior space of that child. The laughter that had come out so freely was noted in some part of her that was doing a kind of continuous accounting as a thing that cost something. The exuberance that had felt, a moment before, entirely natural, the fullness of it, the animal completeness of genuine, unrehearsed delight, was registered in that wordless accounting as something to be monitored, not forbidden, not punished, merely watched, and the watching, over time, would become second nature, and the second nature would become first nature, and what had been a living, spontaneous thing would grow somewhat quieter, then somewhat smaller, and then take up residence in a part of her that she stopped being aware of visiting. This is how it begins, not with a single act of suppression, deliberate enough to be remembered and examined, not with a wound dramatic enough to be named, but with the slow, daily, entirely understandable calibration of a self-learning which of its expressions the world can hold and which it cannot, which parts of its own aliveness are welcome, and which parts, though never exactly forbidden, are simply not encouraged, simply allowed to grow still. Jung spent years trying to understand this process. He was not the first person to notice that human beings contain more than they present, but he was among the first to give the hidden portion a name precise enough to work with, to trace with something like scientific attention the way the invisible interior life accumulates from all the material that the visible social self has, for one reason or another, set aside. He called the visible social self the persona. The word came from Latin, the mask worn by actors in ancient Roman theater, held before the face to indicate the role being performed. Jung borrowed it deliberately, not to suggest that the social self is false, exactly, but to indicate that it is always partial. The persona is not the whole person, it is the person organized for a particular kind of encounter with the world, legible, manageable, appropriate to context. And like the Roman stage mask, it is both useful and limiting. It allows the performance to proceed, but the face behind it is something else, and that face does not stop existing simply because a mask has been placed in front of it. What accumulates behind the mask is what Jung called the shadow. The word carries a darkness in ordinary language, and Jung accepted that connotation without apologizing for it. But he also insisted, with the care of someone who had spent a long professional life looking at what people actually carry, that the shadow is not simply a collection of the worst things a person is capable of. That is the common misunderstanding, and it is worth sitting with the more accurate picture long enough for it to settle into something felt rather than merely acknowledged. Think again of that child at the table. What was filed away in the moment the laughter cooled the room was not evil, it was not dangerous, it was exuberance, that specific animal, whole-bodied quality of delight that has nothing calculating in it. What was quietly set aside was a kind of aliveness, and this, Jung argued, is precisely what the shadow stores with the greatest patience and the greatest care. Not only the impulses that civilization rightly teaches us to contain, but also the vitality, the creativity, the spontaneous and unguarded expression of a self that the world in its ordinary way could not always receive. The persona and the shadow exist in a compensatory relationship. They are, in a sense, each other's explanation. Between the two of them, they account for most of what a person actually is. And the relationship between them has a particular logic. Wherever the persona is most polished, most carefully maintained, most insistently presented to the world, the shadow that accumulates beneath it tends to grow proportionally denser. The more the mask has to carry, the more the face behind it has to hold. A person who has constructed, across the long years of adult life, a persona of absolute reliability, who has made of their competence a kind of identity, who is known in every room they enter as the one who keeps it together, who manages, who does not falter, carries somewhere within them all the years of accumulated uncertainty, the fear and the fatigue, and the genuine wish to set something down, the longing for the kind of collapse that is simply honesty about the weight of things. None of this disappears because it is not performed. It gathers, it deepens, it waits in the place where ungiven things wait. A person who has organized their persona around warmth, who is made of agreeableness, a second skin, whose entire social existence is built on the ease and fluency of their welcome, carries somewhere within them every opinion that was swallowed rather than spoken, every honest refusal that was softened into compliance, every anger that was converted before it could arrive at the surface, into understanding. The warmth is real, It is not being questioned, but the warmth has a counterpart, and the counterpart is equally real, and it lives in the part of the interior that is no longer visited. This is not a story about deception. The persona is not a lie. The persona is what socialization produces in every human being who has successfully learned to live among other human beings. The shadow is the cost of that learning. The psychological price of belonging to a culture, Jung held, is that the culture shapes you, and the shaping, however necessary, always involves setting something aside. There is no version of this process that does not produce a shadow. There is no civilized self that does not have an accumulation of the unacknowledged behind it. The shadow is not pathology, it is structure. Every child begins by being everything at once. The very young are exuberant, and then enraged, and then dissolving into tears, and then laughing again, not cycling through states so much as inhabiting each one entirely, with the complete, unqualified presence that adults tend to call being difficult, and children simply experience as being themselves. Then the education begins. Not the formal education, the deeper, older kind, the education of living alongside other people who have already had their education, who have already learned which expressions are welcome and which are not, and who communicate this knowledge with the effortless authority of those who do not know they are teaching. The child at the table learns. The child in the classroom learns. The child on the neighborhood street, in the presence of other children who already know the social rules, learns. Each lesson is small and rarely conscious and almost never cruel. A gesture is not repeated because the room went quiet when it was made. A quality of feeling is kept back because the other children looked at one another when it came out. A way of being that felt entirely natural is gradually, without announcement, retired from active expression and taken somewhere interior, somewhere private, somewhere without a name or a location, somewhere that will not be reopened for a very long time, if ever. What makes this worth understanding is not that the shadow is the villain of the story. What makes it worth understanding is that the shadow is still there. The things that were set aside were not destroyed by being set aside. The vitality is still alive. The creativity is still present. The exuberance that was quieted at the dinner table has not evaporated. It has gone somewhere, and it is still there, waiting in the way that all stored energy waits, patient and undiminished. This is the part that tends to surprise people when they encounter it seriously for the first time. The assumption is that what was suppressed was the darkness, the aggression, the selfishness, the impulses civilization rightly teaches us to manage. And those things are in the shadow, Jung would be the first to say. They are genuinely there. But they share the shadow with an enormous quantity of simply unlived life. The qualities that were not dangerous, but merely inconvenient. The expressions that were not immoral, but merely unwelcome in a particular room at a particular time. The parts of the self that were not set aside because they were bad, but because in the specific social world of this specific person's formation, they did not fit. The analyst Robert Johnson, who spent decades working within the Jungian tradition, gave a particular name to this phenomenon. He called it the golden shadow. The idea is almost startling in its precision, that people do not suppress only what they are ashamed of, but also what they were, for whatever reason told they could not have. That a child who grows up in an environment where brilliance is considered threatening might learn to dim their own intelligence as automatically as a child learns not to put their elbows on the table. That a person who was raised to believe that taking up space is presumptuous might deposit their natural authority in the shadow as efficiently and unconsciously as anything else the world could not hold. And then something strange happens. What was deposited does not simply stay there, it returns, not from the front where it would be recognized and owned, but from the side, through the image of another person, someone admired with an intensity that puzzles even the one doing the admiring, someone envied with a specificity and heat that feels from the inside entirely about the other person's qualities and not at all about one's own interior geography. A person watching a colleague move through a room with natural authority, laughing freely, disagreeing when they disagree, occupying their own space without apology, and feeling, in response to this entirely ordinary display, something that is not quite admiration and not quite resentment, but something that partakes of both, is not simply having a reaction to another person. They are having a reaction to something they recognize, something that was theirs, and that was stored somewhere long ago, and that is now being presented back to them in the form of someone who kept what they set aside. This is what Jung called projection. Not in the loose accusatory sense, the idea that someone is projecting their emotions onto a situation where they do not belong. In the precise psychological sense, the unconscious attribution to another person of qualities that belong to oneself, qualities that cannot yet be owned directly, and so are seen with perfect accuracy and complete misrecognition in the person across the room. Projection is the shadow's primary way of making itself known in the world of relationships. It is astonishingly consistent in its logic. The person who has suppressed their own competitive instincts tends to perceive others as endlessly, unreasonably competitive. The person who has never permitted themselves a genuine act of selfishness tends to be preoccupied with a vigilance disproportionate to the actual evidence by the selfishness of people around them. The person who was taught in early life that anger is dangerous and that good people do not feel it tends to carry a finely calibrated radar for the anger of others, while remaining entirely convinced in the presence of their own slow, steady, nameless fury, that what they feel is simply a sense of justice. The feeling is always real. The perception is always sincere. What it is pointing at is something the person cannot yet see from the inside, and so it goes looking for itself on the outside. And it finds, with the efficiency of a well-organized system, exactly what it needs to find. Not because the world is being distorted. Exactly. The competitive colleague may genuinely be competitive. The selfish friend may genuinely be selfish. But because the intensity of the reaction and its particular insistent quality is not explained by what is actually there in the other person, the intensity is shadow material. It is the force of the disowned pressing outward, looking for acknowledgement through the only route that is currently open to it. There is a useful quality in this, if it can be approached without too much discomfort. The things that produce the most vivid reactions, the people who are most consistently irritating, the qualities that provoke the most reliable and specific annoyance, function in the Jungian understanding as a kind of compass, not a pleasant one, not one that a person is likely to consult voluntarily, but a compass nonetheless, pointing with considerable accuracy back toward an interior direction that has not yet been agreed to face. This is why Jung regarded the capacity to withdraw projections, to take back gradually, and with great difficulty, the qualities one has been carrying outside oneself by placing them on others as one of the most demanding and genuinely transformative practices available to someone who takes their own interior life seriously. It is demanding not because the process is technically difficult, but because it requires a particular quality of honesty that feels, when it first arrives, like loss. To withdraw the projection of one's own suppressed brilliance from the colleague who seems effortlessly gifted is to admit that the brilliance was never entirely theirs. To withdraw the projection of one's own unacknowledged anger from the person who seems always to be in the way is to sit for the first time with something hot and old and personal that cannot now be placed somewhere else. None of this is quick. None of it arrives as a single revelation that reorganizes everything at once. It comes slowly, the way all honest interior work tends to come, in small recognitions that accumulate over time into something that begins, eventually, to look like self-knowledge. A quality of irritation that keeps returning in roughly similar situations with similar people, that has a specific texture to it, a sharpness that exceeds what the situation explains. This recurring quality is not a flaw in perception. It is the shadow signaling through the only channel currently available to it, the charged quality of reaction to another person. And the signal, if followed carefully and without too much urgency, tends to point back towards something that was deposited a long time ago and has been waiting there since, in the part of the interior that does not forget. There is something in the way a person responds to someone they admire excessively, with a devotion that has a slightly bewildered quality to it, a following that feels more like searching than appreciating, that is worth examining in this light. The word Johnson coined, the golden shadow, tries to name this precisely, the phenomenon of worshiping in another person exactly what one has been taught, by whatever combination of circumstance and culture and family expectation, not to allow oneself to be. The mentor followed with an intensity that goes beyond gratitude. The artist whose work produces not simply appreciation, but a kind of grief. The person encountered briefly, who seems to carry a quality of being fully alive that is felt in the encountering, not as something foreign and admirable, but as something almost painfully familiar, like something glimpsed through glass, recognized immediately, belonging to the observer in some way that cannot yet be articulated. The grief in the admiration is real. It is not a misplaced emotion. It is the accurate response of someone standing in front of what they were told they could not have, or could not be, or did not deserve to become, standing in front of it, now in the form of another person who either was told differently or found their way to it regardless, and recognizing it without yet having the language to say what exactly they are recognizing. This is the golden shadow at its clearest, the way human beings tend to place on pedestals and worship in others precisely what they have forbidden themselves, the way the act of excessive admiration so often contains, folded inside it, a kind of disowned self-portrait. The shadow is not a wound. That distinction matters enormously, and it is one Jung returned to with some insistence. To frame the shadow as a wound would be to suggest that it is something that was done to a person from the outside, something that leaves a mark requiring healing, something the individual suffered rather than accumulated. The shadow is not that. The shadow is a structure. It is what any human being, living among other human beings and trying to belong among them, inevitably and universally develops. It is not the result of an unusually painful childhood or an unusually repressive culture, though both of those things will shape its particular contents. It is the result of being human in the company of other humans, and this means something important about what the shadow actually is. It is not the enemy. It is not even, at its core, the problem. The problem, if the word problem can be used at all, is the unawareness, the shadow operating without acknowledgement, the projections running without recognition, the irritations repeating without examination, the admiration cycling without the question of what exactly is being admired and why the problem is not what is stored. The problem is that it is stored without being known, because what is stored is not gone. The exuberance that was quieted at the dinner table is still alive. The anger that was converted into understanding is still present. The authority that was dimmed in the service of belonging is still there, in the shadow, undiminished, patient, waiting with the patience of all things that have nowhere else to go. The shadow is, among other things, a storehouse, and what a storehouse holds depends on the particular life that filled it, the particular culture, the particular family, the particular set of early relationships in which the self was first learning which of its expressions were welcome and which were not. The content of any particular shadow is, in this sense, a kind of autobiography. It is a record, written in the language of omission, of what the self was and was not allowed to become. Every quality that was suppressed, every impulse that was managed, every form of expression that was quietly retired from active use, has left its shape in the shadow, precisely defined, fully intact, still carrying the energy that was never discharged. And the shadow is not merely passive. It does not simply hold what was given to it and wait. It acts. It acts through the reactions that seem disproportionate and cannot be explained by their apparent cause. It acts through the patterns that repeat across relationships and situations despite every intention to change them. It acts through the quality of attention given to certain kinds of people, the ones who provoke, the ones who fascinate, the ones who are followed with a devotion that has, if examined carefully, a question inside it, rather than simply an admiration. The shadow acts through dreams too, through the figures that appear in the night with a vividness and an authority that daylight does not easily explain. The threatening stranger in the corridor, the figure who does what the dreamer would never do, who moves through the dream with a freedom that the dreamer watches with a particular mixture of alarm and recognition. These figures, Jung held, are not alien visitors. They are aspects of the interior life that have been denied the direct route and have found instead the indirect one, arriving in sleep where the persona is not on duty and the shadow can move more freely. None of this requires extraordinary self-knowledge to begin to recognize. It requires only a quality of honest attention to the texture of one's own reactions, a willingness to sit with the question of why this, why now, why this particular person provokes this particular intensity, and to stay with the question long enough for it to point somewhere other than the obvious direction. The capacity for this kind of attention is itself already a form of the work. Not the dramatic confrontation, not the grand revelation, but the small patient act of noticing a reaction before it has fully expressed itself, and asking, without urgency, what it might be carrying. This is shadow work, at its quietest and most ordinary, available not only in the therapist's office or the analyst's consulting room, but in the course of any life willing to look at itself with honest and unhurried eyes. There is a particular quality of stillness that arrives, sometimes when a person is alone with a thought they have been avoiding for a long time. When the thought is finally allowed to be present without immediately being managed or explained away. It is not a comfortable stillness. It has something of the feeling of a room where a window has been opened after a long winter of keeping everything closed, and the cold air is genuinely cold, and the cold is also genuinely fresh. Something changes in that quality of air. Something that has been standing still for a very long time begins very slowly to move. The shadow has been called many things across the history of human beings, trying to account for their own interior life. The other, the double, the dark twin, the hidden half. Before Jung gave it a name in a clinical context, the thing he was trying to describe was already being described in stories, in dreams, in the intuitions of anyone who had noticed that what they kept from the world had not stopped existing simply because it was kept. What Jung did was look at this universal human experience with the patience of a scientist and the curiosity of a philosopher, and he arrived at something that held: the shadow is not accidental, not individual, not pathological. It is the structural companion of every human self, present wherever a self has been shaped by a world that could not hold all of it. And what the shadow holds is not lost. This, finally, is what makes the whole subject worth sitting with. Not the drama of it, not the clinical vocabulary of it, not even the philosophical precision of it, but the simple and somewhat extraordinary fact that what was set aside was not destroyed. The part of a person that was too much for the room, too large for the moment, too genuine for the particular social contract of a particular family or culture or period of life, that part did not vanish. It withdrew. And withdrawal is not disappearance. The storehouse of a life is not an empty room. It is a room that has not been visited in a long time, and in which the things placed there in the ordinary and understandable way of all growing up and all belonging among others are still exactly where they were left, intact, waiting, complete. The first step toward any of that is simply knowing it is there, knowing that behind the persona, behind the competent, agreeable, reliable, appropriate version of the self that moves through the world and manages its encounters with practiced skill, there is another room, older and less organized, holding what the world could not receive. Not everything in that room is comfortable, but not everything in that room is dark. Much of it is simply what was once entirely natural, the laughter that rose too freely, the opinion that was never given, the quality of presence that was dimmed in the service of belonging. The storehouse contains a life, not only the life that was lived, but the life that was set aside, and that second life, with all its unlived vitality, is still there, patient as all things that have nowhere else to go, waiting in the quiet of the interior, without urgency, without demand, simply present in the way that everything we carry within us is always present, whether or not we have agreed to look, by firelight. In the long winters of the Norse North, a storyteller's voice would change when Loki entered the tale. It was a specific change, not louder, not more theatrical, something quieter than that, a slight deepening, a leaning in from both the voice and the gathered listeners, as though the air in the hall had altered its quality, as though something long familiar had stepped into the room and could now be looked at without pretending it was not there. The other gods were stories about what people wished to be. Loki was a story about what people already knew themselves to be, underneath the wishing. In the winter halls of Iceland and Norway, 1,000 years before anyone had words like unconscious or archetype or collective shadow, audiences leaned toward the trickster as toward something they recognized immediately and from the inside. His treachery did not repel them. His chaos, his appetites, his cheerful willingness to transgress every order that the other gods had agreed to maintain, none of it kept them at a comfortable distance. It drew them in. And the question worth holding in the long quiet of a night like this is why a figure who embodied everything a culture formally rejected should be the figure a culture could not stop telling stories about, could not stop gathering around in the dark to hear again. The answer had to wait 1,000 years for Carl Jung to begin assembling it, but when he did, he was certain he had found not a curiosity of Norse mythology, but a truth about the structure of all human consciousness, a truth that every storytelling tradition had arrived at independently, by a different path, in a different language, but landing always in the same essential place. Jung had been thinking about the shadow for decades before he turned his attention fully to the figures that crowd the world's mythological traditions. He had watched the shadow form in the consulting room, in the dreams his patients brought him, in the projections they carried into their relationships. He had watched it in himself, most of all, in the long, strange interior years of his own confrontation with the unconscious, when he had deliberately descended into the imagery arising from his own depths, and found there figures who would not be managed or dismissed, who argued back, who told him things he had not decided to know. What he had found in his own interior had a shape, and when he looked at the myths, he found the same shape, rendered in different colors, but unmistakably the same. The trickster was where he looked first, or where the evidence was most concentrated. In his essay on the psychology of the trickster figure, written in 1954, Jung traced the god of disruption and amorality across traditions that had never made contact with one another. Loki in Norse mythology, Coyote in the storytelling traditions of the native peoples of North America, Hermes in the Greek world, Thief, messenger, guide of the dead, the god who moved between all realms and was bound by none. Anansi in West African tradition, the spider who lived by wit rather than virtue, who rewrote the rules of every situation he entered and answered to no authority he had not personally decided to respect. These figures did not appear in their traditions as villains. Exactly. That was the important thing. They were not placed opposite the heroes as antagonists to be defeated. They occupied a stranger, more necessary role. They moved through sacred stories as the element that could not be planned for, the factor that broke every structure that had grown too rigid to hold the actual complexity of life. When Loki betrayed the gods in the Norse tradition, the betrayal was catastrophic, and also, at some level, the stories did not quite say aloud, but clearly felt necessary. The ordered world the gods maintained was not the whole of what existence was. Something outside that order kept insisting on making its presence known. Jung saw in the trickster the oldest and most primitive stratum of the shadow, not the shadow as an individual accumulates it, the specific things buried during a specific childhood in a specific social world, but the shadow as something older, something inherited rather than acquired, something structural to consciousness itself. The chaos and transgression the trickster embodied were not aberrations. They were the permanent undercurrent of instinct and appetite and amoral vitality that every civilization requires its members to suppress, that never disappears because it is suppressed, and that finds its way into expression through the back door of story when the front door of direct acknowledgement is barred. The communities gathered around the winter fire were not endorsing what Loki did. They were not gathering to celebrate transgression. They were doing something more careful than that. They were giving a name and a face to the force they knew from their own interior experience, the impulse that ran counter to everything they had agreed to value, the chaos that lived at the edge of every ordered life. And in naming it, in giving it a seat at the fire, they were doing what human beings have always done with what they cannot eliminate. They were making it a story, and thereby making it survivable. This is the oldest function of myth, understood through Jung's frame, not to celebrate the good or condemn the bad, not to offer moral instruction from above, but to hold, in the contained space of narrative, everything that human experience actually contains, including what the daylight world requires people to pretend is not there. A tradition that tells trickster stories is a tradition that has found a way to acknowledge the shadow without being possessed by it. The fire is lit, the voice changes, the god of disruption takes his place in the story, and something that had no other channel of expression finds, for the length of the telling, a form it can rest inside. Jung held that this was not merely a historical curiosity. The same need that generated trickster stories in the winter halls of Iceland was generating something in the modern world, something less contained, less elegant, less deliberately shaped for the purpose. When a culture abandons the symbolic forms that gave the shadow a place to live, the shadow does not disappear. It finds other expressions, wilder ones, less articulate ones. The fire goes out, the voice falls silent, the trickster is dismissed as primitive superstition, and then appears again somewhere else, in some less ceremonial form, without the story's structure to hold it. But it was not only the trickster that drew Jung's attention. His thinking ranged much further and much older, in the traditions of the ancient Near East, in the cosmologies that preceded and surrounded the emergence of Western monotheism. The presence of darkness had always required a figure, a being, or a force that gave the shadow a name and a face and a place in the structure of existence. Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian religious tradition, had given that figure the name Ahriman, the principle of darkness and destruction, eternal adversary of Ahura Mazda, the principle of light and truth. The two were held in perpetual opposition, and the entire moral structure of that cosmology depended on the reality of both. To be human in that tradition was to exist in the field between them, choosing one or the other with every act and every thought. The Western theological tradition that emerged from monotheism handled this differently and in ways that Jung found philosophically significant. In his 1952 work, written out of a long engagement with the Book of Job, Jung examined the theological status of the devil in Western religious thought and found in that figure one of the most historically consequential acts of collective projection ever undertaken. The devil, as Jung read the tradition, was not a separate being with an independent existence. The devil was the shadow of God, the sum of everything the official theology could not assign to the divine, and so gave to the adversary. Everything dark, everything destructive, everything morally problematic that existed in human experience was collected under that figure and placed outside the human being, outside the divine order, outside the self. It was named, yes. It was given a face, yes. But it was projected outward, located in an external being rather than recognized as something arising from the interior. The problem, as Jung saw it, was not that the theological tradition had acknowledged darkness. It had done that, more honestly, in some ways, than modernity. The problem was where it had placed the darkness. Outside, not inside. The work of confronting one's own darkness, of recognizing the shadow as something arising from within consciousness itself, rather than as an external force invading from without, was made structurally impossible by a theology that gave every shadow content its own separate supernatural address. Temptation came from outside. Evil was the devil's work. The individual soul was the site of a battle between external forces, not the source of the forces themselves. Jung was not making an atheological argument here. He was making a psychological one. Whatever a tradition believes about the nature of the divine, the practical consequence of locating all darkness in an external figure is that the individual is relieved of the most demanding aspect of self-knowledge, the recognition that what seems most alien, most threatening, most other, is also most interior. The shadow that the devil collects is the shadow that belongs to the human being, and a tradition that stores that shadow externally in a supernatural receptacle is a tradition whose members have been structurally prevented from doing the work of meeting it honestly. Similar structures operated elsewhere, in traditions Jung had read with sustained attention. In the Buddhist cosmology, the figure of Mara, the Lord of illusion and death, who appears at the moment of the Buddha's enlightenment and attempts to turn him away from liberation, functions as a complex symbolic rendering of the same problem. Mara is not merely evil in the simple sense. Mara is attachment. Mara is the pull of every desire and every fear that keeps consciousness bound to its habitual ways of experiencing the world, unable to see past the constructed surfaces of things to the open space beneath them. And the tradition's treatment of Mara is instructive. The Buddha does not banish Mara. He recognizes Mara. He calls Mara by name. He says, quietly, to the figure that has come to destroy his awakening, "I see you." The recognition itself is the response, not battle, not suppression, not the heroic defeat of an external enemy. Witnessing, this is not far from what Jung meant by shadow integration, the capacity to see what is arising in oneself without either acting it out or suppressing it, to hold it in awareness long enough for the awareness to work its slow alchemy. Is in its structural movement exactly what the Buddha's encounter with Mara enacts at the cosmological level. The tradition translated the interior into myth. The myth preserved the structure of the movement even as it rendered it in symbolic and narrative form. And so the story, told across 2.5 millennia, continued to carry the psychological insight inside it, available to anyone who came to it with the right kind of attention. Joseph Campbell spent his scholarly life following that insight through the world's mythological traditions. Deeply marked by Jung's thinking, Campbell saw in the recurring structure of the hero's journey a story that every culture had arrived at independently and that pointed, underneath its enormous variety of surface forms, at a single essential psychological movement. The hero departs from the known world. The hero descends into some form of underworld, some region of darkness, danger, and dissolution. The hero faces what waits there, and the hero returns, changed, carrying something that was not available at the surface, something that could only be obtained by the descent itself. The monster that waits in the underworld, Campbell argued, is not an external threat. It is a symbolic rendering of the repressed dimensions of the self. The minotaur at the center of the labyrinth, the dragon coiled over the treasure hoard, the whale that swallows Jonah and carries him down into the dark. These are figures for what the hero most fears to face, which is also, always, what the hero most needs to find. The labyrinth is not a geography. The dragon is not a biological event. The belly of the whale is not a location that can be visited. They are forms the interior takes when it needs to be visible, shapes the unconscious gives to its own contents when consciousness is ready, or when circumstances have forced the readiness to look at them directly. What drew Campbell's attention, and what connects his reading of myth to Jung's, is the quality of the encounter the hero must have with the monster. Flight does not work. The myths are explicit about this. The hero who runs from the monster cannot obtain the treasure and cannot return to the community with what it needs. The descent is necessary. The encounter is necessary. The only way through is through, and the monster is not the obstacle to the return, but the necessary station on the path toward it. Theseus must enter the labyrinth and meet the minotaur in the dark at its center. Jonah must be swallowed, must sit in the darkness of the whale's interior, must wait there long enough for something to change before the whale releases him. Perseus must face the Medusa, and must do so critically, not directly, but reflected in a shield, which the myth encodes as the oblique attention required when the thing being faced is not yet survivable by direct confrontation. Even the indirection is part of the structure. Even the way of meeting the shadow is a wisdom the myth is carrying and transmitting. The Orphic descent tradition in Greek mythology gave this movement its most elaborate symbolic form. Orpheus descends to the underworld not for treasure and not for survival, but for love, and the condition of his return is the most psychologically precise detail in all of Greek myth. He must walk back toward the surface without turning around to look at what he is leading. He must trust that what follows him is following him without the confirmation of direct vision, and he cannot do it. He turns, he looks, and in the looking, he loses what he was bringing back. The myth says something that could be said no other way, that there are contents of the interior which, when they become conscious too quickly, before the capacity to hold them has been adequately prepared, dissolve under the pressure of direct observation. The work of approaching them requires a kind of patient indirection. It requires the trust of a man walking upward in the dark, who has not yet learned to walk upward without needing to see. Jung returned to these stories not as a literary scholar, but as someone who had made the descent himself in the years after the break with Freud, and who recognized in the mythological structures an accurate map of interior territory he had actually crossed. When he read Orpheus, he was reading a description of something he had encountered. When he read Theseus, he recognized the quality of attention the labyrinthine interior demanded, not the straight line assault of direct confrontation, but the patient threading through, with one hand on the wall, into the dark at the center. The alchemists had found another language for the same territory, and Jung spent decades attending to it. The Western alchemical tradition, which had flourished from the late classical period through the Renaissance, was understood by those who did not look closely at it as a failed proto-chemistry, a pre-scientific attempt to transmute base metals into gold that eventually gave way to the real thing. Jung read it more carefully. He read the alchemical texts not as failed chemistry, but as elaborate symbolic renderings of psychological process, a tradition of inner work that had been compelled by the absence of a psychological vocabulary to project its subject matter onto the material world and describe it in the language of metals and furnaces and stages of chemical transformation. The alchemist in the stone chamber bent over the crucible, watching base matter dissolve and reform under heat. This was not, Jung argued, merely a practical experiment. It was simultaneously a process happening in the alchemist's own interior. The alchemist who worked with the prima materia, the raw, undifferentiated matter that had to be subjected to a sequence of dissolving and refining processes, was also working with the prima materia of his own psyche, the unacknowledged, the undifferentiated, the dark contents that had to be submitted to the slow fire of consciousness before they could be refined into something the whole person could use. The stages of the alchemical process, the nigredo, the blackening, the initial dissolution of form into something formless and dark, the albedo, the whitening, the emergence of something clarified from the dissolution, the rubedo, the reddening, the final integration of what had been separated, corresponded, as Jung read them, to the stages of psychological transformation that shadow work enacts in the individual interior. The blackening first, the willingness to enter the darkness, to allow the structures one has relied on to dissolve, to sit with the formlessness before the new form begins to emerge. Then the gradual clarification, then the integration that returns both the darkness and the light to a single, held, dynamic whole. The name the alchemists gave to what the process aimed at was the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone, the substance that could transmute base matter into gold. But what drew Jung's attention was not the gold. It was the conjunctia oppositorum, the union of opposites, which the alchemists described as the principle on which the stone's power rested. The stone worked not because it was purely one thing, but because it held two things in tension that most substances could not simultaneously contain: the sun and the moon, the king and the queen, the fixed and the volatile, the conscious and the unconscious. Light and shadow, held not in the suppression of one by the other, but in the dynamic, productive, tension-sustaining marriage of both. This was, for Jung, the clearest symbolic statement of what individuation was trying to arrive at. Not the elimination of the shadow, not its defeat, not its submission. The conjunction, the union, the self that has learned to hold its own darkness and its own light together, not as a resolution that dissolves the tension between them, but as a living relationship that depends on the tension remaining. Gold made not from the absence of base matter, but from its transformation. Wholeness made not from the elimination of the shadow, but from its integration into something larger than either the light or the dark could constitute alone. A Chinese manuscript from the Tang dynasty, painted with careful strokes in a monastery where that kind of care was considered a form of prayer, showed the Taijitu, the circle divided by the S-curve, into its two fields of dark and light, the small seed of darkness inside the light, the small seed of light inside the dark. It took centuries of philosophical attention to arrive at that image. The precision of the small seeds is the thing, not the two halves which anyone can draw, but the seeds inside each half, which insist that no field is pure, that the light always contains the beginning of its own darkness, that the dark always carries the origin of what will become light again. Jung encountered this image and recognized in it, across the vast distance of culture and century and tradition, a diagram of the same interior territory the alchemists had been mapping in their stone chambers, the same truth the winter storytellers had been enacting around the fire when the trickster's name was spoken and the gathered listeners leaned in. The Kali icon in a Hindu temple is not comfortable to look at if one approaches it from outside the tradition. The dark form, the garland of skulls, the protruding tongue, the sword raised, the dance on the prone body of Shiva, these are not images designed to produce the peaceful reassurance of what Western aesthetic culture conventionally calls the beautiful. They are something older and more demanding than that. They are images designed to hold, within a single form, the complete truth of what existence is, creative and destructive simultaneously, nurturing and consuming in the same gesture, the giver of life and the thing that ends it, both at once, neither canceling the other, the wholeness made of the tension between them. The tradition that generated the Kali image was not in crisis about this. It had found a way to look at destruction without flinching, not because it was callous about suffering, but because it had embedded destruction inside a larger frame in which destruction was not the last word. The skull garland was not a horror, it was an acknowledgement. Life feeds on life. The cosmos destroys what it creates, and creates from what it destroys. The tradition that could render this in a single image, that could give this complete double truth, a face and a name, and a place in the temple beside the other faces of the divine. That tradition had done something psychologically significant. It had refused the comfortable simplification. It had insisted on the whole. Jung spent his scholarly life arguing that modernity had lost access to this kind of image, and that the loss was consequential. The symbolic traditions that had given the shadow a face, the trickster's shifting grin, the devil's adversarial glare, Kali's dark dance, the blackening prima materia in the alchemist's crucible, had been dismissed as superstition, as primitive projection, as the confused pre-scientific imagination, making sense of a world it did not yet have the tools to understand properly. What remained in their absence was not a shadow-free world. It was a world in which the shadow had lost its symbolic address and was therefore harder to find, harder to name, harder to look at honestly and with the deliberate attention that looking requires. The fire had gone out. The voice had fallen silent. The trickster had been evicted from the winter hall, but the trickster's energy had not gone anywhere. It had only gone underground without a story to contain it. There is something in the long record of human symbolic life that functions as a kind of collective memory, a repository of psychological knowledge accumulated across thousands of years and stored not in books exactly or in scientific papers, but in the structure of the stories and images that a tradition preserves and returns to generation after generation. The myths know things, not in the way that a text knows things, proposing and defending and citing evidence. They know things in the way that the body knows to breathe, structurally, without requiring the decision to know it, carrying the knowledge in the movement itself. When the Norse skald's voice changed as Loki entered the story, the people in the room knew something together that they would not have been able to say in ordinary language. They knew the shape of the force that transgressed all order. They knew its energy from the inside, and the story gave that energy a place to live for the duration of the telling, a container, a form, a fire-lit space in which it could be acknowledged and moved through and released so that the people who had gathered could return to the ordered life the village required of them, having, for an hour, looked honestly at what lived in the dark outside it. Every tradition has built that kind of container. The forms differ enormously. The winter hall, the alchemist's crucible, the Kali temple, the labyrinthine myth, the Taijitu circle drawn in monastery ink. The materials are different. The vocabularies are different. The theologies are different, where there are theologies, but the structure underneath them is the same. Human beings, across every culture and every age, have been trying to find a form large enough to hold all of what they are, not the approved version, not the daylight version, all of it. The alchemical image that returns at the end of this long survey is the conjunction, the marriage of sun and moon, the union of the fixed and the volatile, the conjunction of the two things that cannot easily coexist, and yet whose coexistence is the condition of the gold. It is a symbol of something that was never fully achieved by any alchemist, in any crucible, in any century. The stone was always a few stages away, the final conjunction always still in process, the symbol always pointing toward a completion that remained ahead. This is not a failure of the tradition. It is the tradition's deepest honesty, the work of holding light and shadow together in a single life, in a single consciousness, in a single image. That work is not something that arrives and is done. It is something that is always and only in the doing. The mandala is not finished. The crucible is still on the fire. The skald is still speaking. The small seeds of darkness and light inside each other's fields are still turning, slowly, in their ancient and unhurrying circle. Human beings have always been trying to say this, in story and symbol and ritual, in the careful strokes of monastery ink, in the lamplight of the stone chamber, in the voice that changes when the trickster steps into the tale. The attempt is the same, and it is very old, and it has not reached its end, and the images that were made in the trying are still warm. The house at Kusnacht stood close to the lake. and in winter the cold came off the water in the evenings and settled against the windows in a way that made the study feel both enclosed and vast. It was the winter of 1913, perhaps early 1914, and Carl Jung sat at his desk with a lamp burning low, and the painted pages of what would eventually become his Red Book spread before him like a country he was only beginning to learn to read. The professional alliance that had shaped the preceding years was gone. The correspondence had slowed, then stopped. Outside, the world continued its ordinary movement, patients to see, lectures to prepare, the household sounds of a family settling toward sleep, and inside, something else entirely was beginning. What Jung began in that room was not therapy. It was not research in any sense that the word usually carries. It was something more like a deliberate descent, a choice made with full consciousness to follow the imagery arising from the deeper strata of his own interior, and to meet whatever waited there, not as a detached observer cataloging symptoms, but as a participant engaged in genuine encounter. He would sit in that particular quality of stillness that falls between waking and sleep. Let the images come and then speak to them. He wrote down what they said back. He painted what he saw. The pages accumulated, strange figures, dark landscapes, conversations with presences that seemed to know more about him than he had yet allowed himself to know about himself. The method he was inventing in those cold lamplit evenings he would later call active imagination. The name came later. The practice came first, born not from theory, but from necessity, from the recognition that something in the interior demanded not analysis, but attention, not reduction, but relationship. Active imagination, as Jung eventually described it in an essay written around 1916, though it would not reach publication for decades, begins in a state somewhere between full waking and sleep. The grip of ordinary directed thought is loosened. The linear, purposeful mind steps back without disappearing entirely, and into the space that opens, the unconscious begins to move. Figures arrive, a dwarf in a passage, an old woman on a road, a threatening stranger in a landscape the dreamer has never visited. The essential discipline and what distinguishes this practice from simple fantasy or passive daydream is what comes next. The ego does not observe these figures from a safe distance, cataloging them like specimens. It enters into genuine dialogue. It asks the threatening stranger what it wants. It listens to the answer. It argues, agrees, refuses, and listens again. The stance required is double: present enough to engage, grounded enough not to be swept away by what emerges. It is a narrow path. Too much detachment, and the encounter becomes mere observation, the unconscious performing for a passive audience rather than meeting a genuine interlocutor. Too little, and the ego loses its footing, overwhelmed by the force of what has been waiting in the dark, dissolved into it rather than transformed by it. Jung held that line for years in that study, learning through direct experience the difference between meeting the unconscious and being taken by it. What came to him in those years was difficult material, figures who challenged him, who told him things about himself he had not arranged to hear, imagery that his training gave him frameworks for, but that exceeded the frameworks in ways that required new ones. He painted the encounters in vivid color, wrote the conversations out longhand, returned the next evening, and continued. The Red Book that grew from this practice is not easily categorized, not a diary, not a treatise, not a work of art in any ordinary sense, though it contains all of these. It is, most accurately, the record of a man conducting a sustained and morally serious conversation with his own interior darkness, and refusing to let the conversation be comfortable. The comfort, in Jung's understanding, was precisely the thing to be suspicious of. In Asterisk, A Polish and Asterisk, published in 1951, he wrote about shadow work in terms that carry a specific moral weight. Most descriptions of psychological practice tend to soften. The confrontation with the shadow, he insisted, is not a matter of abstract self-acceptance, a warm acknowledgement that everyone has flaws, an affectionate inventory of personal quirks. It demands something more precise and considerably more uncomfortable than that. It requires the naming, specific and unsparing, of the actual cruelties one has committed, the actual cowardices one has enacted, the actual motivations one has preferred not to examine, because examining them would require a significant revision of the story one tells about oneself. Jung called the suffering that this kind of honest self-confrontation generates moral suffering. The word is chosen carefully. It is not the suffering of illness or loss, the suffering that falls from outside and to which one is essentially passive. Moral suffering arises from seeing, from the particular discomfort of encountering one's own face in a mirror, arranged to show the parts one has kept out of frame. It is, he argued, irreplaceable. There is no way around it that does not also root around the change it makes possible. The insight purchased without it tends to remain an insight in language only, something known but not felt, acknowledged but not owned. Sitting with that kind of seeing is not easy. The natural impulse is to move away from it, to reframe, to contextualize, to locate the fault elsewhere, to remember mitigating circumstances, to remind oneself of the good one has also done. All of these movements are recognizable. All of them are, from this point of view, the shadow's own protective maneuvers, the way the unacknowledged material keeps itself unacknowledged by keeping the one doing the looking just slightly off angle from the thing that needs to be seen. The practice of sitting with the accurate picture without immediately moving to repair or excuse it is what Jung meant by moral courage. Not the courage of action, but the courage of perception. The willingness to remain with what is genuinely uncomfortable long enough for something to shift, not because the shift has been willed or manufactured, but because honest attention, held steadily, changes the relationship between the ego and what it has been refusing to carry. Dreams, in this framework, become not merely interesting nocturnal experiences, but something more like a correspondence, the psyche writing back to the conscious mind with its own assessment of the current situation. Jung extended the understanding he had inherited from Freud, that dreams open a path toward the unconscious that ordinary waking life tends to keep closed, but where Freud's reading of that path tended toward the personal and the driven, wish fulfillment, disguised desire, the pressure of repressed instinct, seeking release. Jung's reading ranged further and moved differently. For Jung, the dream was the psyche's compensatory drama. The interior life tends toward balance, toward wholeness, and when the conscious attitude has moved too far in one direction, too rigid, too defended, too identified with a particular self-image, the dream moves in the other direction to correct. The figure who appears threatening in the dream landscape of a person who believes themselves thoroughly mild and accommodating is not a random product of neural activity. It is, in this reading, the psyche staging the confrontation the waking life has been too careful to allow. And the figures who threaten tend to be specific. They tend to appear as the same sex as the dreamer. They carry the qualities the dreamer most vehemently disavows. The intensity of their menace is proportional to the distance between who the dreamer believes themselves to be and what the shadow actually contains. A person who has suppressed their own capacity for anger dreams of a violent stranger. A person who has buried their own ambition dreams of a ruthless competitor they cannot escape. A person who has denied their own grief dreams of a weeping figure they cannot help. The dream does not present these figures as enemies to be defeated, it presents them as presences requiring encounter. The practice of meeting those figures in the waking record of the night, returning to them in the early morning, with a notebook, writing out the scene, sitting with the quality of feeling it left behind, is not a method designed to produce comfort. It is designed to produce recognition, the slow, uncomfortable recognition that the stranger in the corridor was not a stranger at all, but a part of the dreamer, that the dreamer has been at considerable effort to avoid. Writing the dream down before it dissolves is itself an act of significance. Dreams move away quickly from waking consciousness, retreating from the light of ordinary thought like something not designed to survive in that climate. To hold one in writing, to slow the dissolution by giving it language, however inadequate, is to perform, in a small and patient way, the same act Jung performed on a larger scale in those Kusnacht evenings, the act of witnessing one's own interior with deliberate, unhurried attention, without immediately requiring it to mean something useful or become something manageable. The attention itself is the work. Before any interpretation, before any integration, the attention is the first and most fundamental act, the refusal to let the interior life pass unnoticed, unrecorded, unnamed. There is a danger in this work that deserves an honest naming, not because it is cause for alarm, but because it is cause for care. Jung observed it in certain of his patients, and the analysts who followed him have given it a name: inflation. The word carries its own image, something expanded beyond its natural size, under pressure, taught in a way that distorts its original shape. Psychological inflation describes the condition in which the ego, having begun to make contact with the deeper layers of the psyche, makes a subtle but consequential error in orientation. Instead of integrating what it finds, drawing it into conscious awareness while remaining distinct from it, enlarged but still grounded, the ego identifies with it. It takes on the charge, the authority, the quality of something far larger than an ordinary human person. What tends to happen in this condition is that the person engaged in the work begins to feel, quietly or loudly, exceptional. The encounter with archetypal material, with figures and images that carry the condensed weight of very old human experience, can produce the sense of having been given access to something others cannot see, of carrying a burden or a gift that ordinary life cannot hold. This is not entirely inaccurate. The unconscious does carry material of genuine depth, but the error lies in what follows, the identification of the personal ego with that depth rather than the ego's continued encounter with it. The person in the grip of inflation is not suffering from too much honesty about themselves. They are suffering from a precise kind of dishonesty, the unconscious exchange of genuine self-knowledge for the more intoxicating experience of felt significance. The shadow has not been integrated. It has been replaced, temporarily and dangerously, by the sense of being somehow beyond the need for ordinary human limitation, ordinary moral accountability, the ordinary humble work of remaining answerable to the people in one's actual life. Edward Edinger, the Jungian analyst who spent decades working with the clinical reality of this condition, described it with care. James Hollis, whose writings on the inner life return again and again to the question of what keeps human beings from their own depths, identifies the warning signs not as dramatic collapse, but as the quieter displacement of genuine self-examination by the inflation's more comfortable substitute, the feeling of having already arrived at a depth that the actual material of one's daily life does not support. Shadow work without grounding, without the ordinary friction of genuine relationship and continued moral accountability, is not integration. It is a more elaborately furnished avoidance. The ground that keeps the work from drifting into inflation is in the end quite simple. The continued presence of the actual people in one's actual life, with their actual needs and their actual assessments, and the continued willingness to be answerable to that reality, rather than to a self constructed image of how far one has traveled inward. The mandala appears in Jung's clinical records at a particular stage of the work, not at the beginning when the shadow's contents are still largely unfamiliar and the ego's defenses are still largely intact. Not in the crisis phase when the discrepancy between the ego's self image and the unconscious's compensatory pressure is at its most disorienting. The mandala tends to appear at a later point when something in the interior has begun to settle, when the opposites that have been in conflict are beginning to find not resolution exactly, but a shared space. The form is ancient, circles organized around a center, symmetric, held in the dreams and artwork of patients who had never encountered the form in any cultural context Jung could identify. The same structure arose independently and with the same qualities, not identical in surface detail, different colors, different inner arrangements, different cultural markers, but consistent in their organizing principle, the circle, the center, the symmetry that implies everything is being held rather than excluded. Jung understood the mandala not as evidence of progress, not as a sign of completion, but as a symbol of the ongoing effort to hold in a single space everything the interior life contains. The opposites are still there: darkness and light, rage and tenderness, the impulse toward destruction and the impulse toward creation. The mandala does not resolve them, it draws a circle around them. It makes of their tension a pattern that can be looked at, sat with, returned to. The drawing of one in a private notebook, slowly, concentrically, page after page across the months, not as art, but as something closer to a practice, is a way of doing, in the hands and on paper, what the interior is being asked to do in its own dimensions. Hold everything that is actually there, without collapsing into any single piece of it. James Hollis has written about the shadow's most persistent and ordinary form in a way that carries a different weight from the dramatic imagery of active imagination and archetypal encounter. Not everyone descends into a red book. Not everyone encounters trickster figures in lamplight or draws mandalas in private notebooks. Most of the shadow's work happens in quieter and more ordinary places. It happens in the middle of the night when sleep will not come, and a question about one's own behavior rises that has been waiting, patient and unhurried, for exactly this moment of insufficient distraction. Hollis identifies two governing fears at the root of most of what the shadow, in its daily form, is protecting. The first, the fear that one is not enough, that the competence, the effort, the care, the love extended into the world are not, at some fundamental level, adequate, that there is a requirement being invisibly failed, a standard being imperceptibly missed, and that if the accounting were done honestly, the numbers would not balance in one's favor. This fear is almost never conscious in its full form. It operates, instead, through the behaviors that have been constructed to manage it: the relentless productivity, the difficulty with rest, the need for external validation that no amount of external validation actually satisfies, the pervasive sense that what has been done is not quite enough, and that what is still to be done might also, finally, not be enough. The second fear is older and in some ways more difficult to sit with directly. It is the fear that if one were genuinely known, not the managed, socially navigated, carefully presented self, but the actual interior of one's experience, including everything that has been kept in the back rooms, one would not be loved. That the revelation of the whole would produce in those who matter most, not the acceptance the surface self has been working to earn, but the withdrawal of it. This fear is the engine behind many of the persona's most carefully maintained walls. The face presented to the world is polished, not merely from vanity, but from a deep protective urgency, the armor of a person who is not certain, at the root, that their actual interior would be welcomed. These fears are not weaknesses. They are not evidence of particular damage or particular inadequacy. Hollis is careful about this. These fears are shadow formations, contents that arose in response to genuine early experiences of conditional love or insufficient safety, and that were placed in the back rooms because there was no other place for them at the time. They carry the same psychological logic as any other shadow content. They were adaptive once, protective once, the best available arrangement given the available resources, and they demand the same kind of attention that any shadow content demands. Not dramatic excavation, not the imposition of a counter-narrative that declares them groundless, not even, necessarily, immediate dissolution. The work in Hollis's account begins with something simpler and more demanding than any of that. It begins with the honest naming of the fear, not in abstract terms that keep it at a theoretical distance, but in specific terms that locate it in the actual texture of one's actual life. To say, with genuine recognition rather than performed candor, there is a fear here that I am not enough. To stay with that sentence long enough to feel its accuracy, to resist the immediate impulse to qualify it, contextualize it, reframe it as a reasonable response to real circumstances, or immediately reassure oneself that the evidence suggests otherwise, just to hold it for a moment with the same quality of attention that one might bring to a figure in a dream as something that exists and deserves recognition before it is managed. That quality of attention is itself a form of the work, not the completion of it, not the profound integration that takes years of patient practice, but the beginning of it. The small, unremarkable, and quietly significant act of turning toward what has been placed in the back room and acknowledging, without drama and without immediate demand for resolution, that it is there. A person sits across from a therapist in an ordinary room. Outside, the day continues its ordinary movement. Inside the room, a conversation is happening that has been avoided, in one form or another, for a long time. The therapist has asked a question that is not a complicated question. The person finds that it is very difficult to answer, not because the answer is unknown, it is uncomfortably quite known, but because saying it aloud in this particular room, with another person listening, makes it real in a way that keeping it internal has not. The words arrive slowly, a specific behavior is named, a specific pattern is acknowledged. For the first time, the framing that has always been used, the one that locates the cause elsewhere, that positions the self as primarily responding to external conditions, is set aside. What follows is a silence. Not the silence of comfort, not the silence of resolution, but a specific silence that is neither comfortable nor unbearable. The kind of silence that comes after something accurate has been said. The therapist does not rush to fill it. The person does not rush to take it back. For a moment, something that has been in the back room is simply present in the room, acknowledged, held, neither dramatized nor denied. This is the moral suffering Jung described, not catastrophic, not disintegrating, but genuinely uncomfortable in a way that the intelligence quickly wants to route around. The willingness to remain in that discomfort to let the accurate picture stay accurate for long enough that something shifts, not by being wished away, but by being honestly held, is in his account the indispensable material from which psychological change is actually made. The shadow is patient. It has been waiting in many cases for years. It does not require urgency in return. The work it asks for is not heroic, not the grand descent into the unconscious that makes for compelling memoir, not the dramatic confrontation with one's own darkness that feels like a scene from a myth. Gayness. Most of it happens in the quiet, unglamorous registers of ordinary life. The small moment of recognition at 3 in the morning, the conversation with a person one has wronged, in which the usual defenses do not quite hold, the gradual, almost imperceptible shift in the feeling one has about a recurring pattern in one's own behavior, as the story used to explain it, slowly loses the conviction it once carried. In the years after Jung's own descent through the images of the Red Book, he began to speak of what he had found in terms that carried a specific quality of resolution, not the resolution of problems solved, but the resolution of someone who had remained in a difficult room long enough to stop finding it quite so difficult. The shadow figures he had encountered in those Kusnacht evenings had not disappeared. They had not been defeated or transcended or persuaded to become something other than what they were. They had been known, and being known by the conscious mind, acknowledged as belonging to the same interior that the ego also inhabited, they had lost the specific quality of menace that comes from being disowned. What remains when the shadow is no longer entirely disowned is not purity. It is not the elimination of darkness from the personality. It is something more like integrity, in the original sense of the word, the state of being integral, undivided, all of a piece. The capacity to act from a self that is not secretly at war with itself, not consuming energy in the maintenance of the gap between the presented face and the actual interior, not generating the characteristic anxiety of a person who is always, at some level, worried about being seen. This is not a permanent achievement. Jung was careful about this. The shadow is not a problem solved and filed away. It is a dimension of the interior that requires continued relationship, continued attention, continued honesty. New material accumulates. Life presents new situations that activate new defenses. The persona is rebuilt and rebuilt again in response to new social contexts, and each rebuilding leaves its own residue. The work is not finished because it cannot be finished. It is, as Jung understood individuation itself to be, a lifelong practice, not a destination, but a direction, sustained not by the certainty of eventual arrival, but by the quality of attention one brings to the ongoing movement. A mandala is drawn slowly. Line by line, the circle takes its shape. Each line is a small return to center. Each small return is enough for the time being. The whole figure takes form, not through a single act of completion, but through the patient repetition of the same fundamental gesture. The turning back, the recentering, the drawing of one more line toward the place from which the others have also come. The fear's Hollis names, the fear of not being enough, the fear of not being lovable if genuinely known, are not the shadow's final word. They are the shadow's most honest word. They carry, beneath their surface as fears, a different quality of experience, the experience of having cared, having wanted, having hoped for something genuine in one's own life and in the lives of the people one has loved. The fear of not being enough is also the evidence of having wanted to be enough, of having carried toward others a kind of attention and effort that mattered to the person carrying it. The fear of not being lovable, if known, is also the evidence of having wanted to be known, of having held, somewhere in the interior, the belief that genuine knowledge of another person and genuine love of another person might be possible. These are not small things. They are among the most significant things a human interior carries. That they have been stored in the back rooms, that they have spent years generating anxiety rather than warmth, is the shadow's particular kind of cost, the price paid when something genuine and vital is placed beyond the reach of ordinary daylight. To name them honestly, without self-condemnation, without the cold language of psychological diagnosis, and without the warm language of easy reassurance, is to do something that changes the nature of what they are, not all at once, slowly, and without the expectation of permanent transformation, but in the direction of something more spacious, more honest, more at ease with the full range of what the interior actually contains, less consumed by the maintenance of the gap between the self one is and the self one has felt required to appear to be. This is what the work is, not a cure, not a completion, a turning toward, patient and repeated, in the small hours of ordinary nights, at ordinary desks in ordinary rooms, where a lamp is burning and something that has been waiting a long time is finally, carefully, being allowed to be seen. The Red Book still exists. Its pages are still vivid, the painted figures still strange and particular and unmistakably the work of a man in genuine interior encounter rather than aesthetic production. Jung left it to his family, and it spent most of a century in a locked metal box in a Swiss bank vault before it was finally published in 2009, long after everyone who had known him was gone. The fact that it was locked away is not incidental. He understood that what it contained was not ready for a world still in the process of deciding what the interior life was and whether it deserved the quality of attention he had given it. What it contains, finally read, is not a solved problem. It is the record of a sustained and serious willingness to stay in the room with what is difficult, to keep the lamp burning, to write down what comes and respond to it honestly, to maintain, night after night across years, the particular quality of attention that transforms the shadow's contents from threats requiring management into companions requiring only and always honest recognition. The fears of not being enough and of not being known without the knowledge producing withdrawal, these fears are not personal failures deserving correction. They are universal formations, the structural marks of being a creature who needed love before it had language for love, and who learned in the process of that needing to keep certain things in rooms the light did not reach, to name them without self-condemnation, to hold them with the quality of attention one might bring to a difficult passage in an old book, curious and present, and not in a hurry to arrive at the summary, is to begin, in that small and quiet act, the return of something that was never lost, only placed for a time, beyond the reach of ordinary seeing. And in that return, however gradual, however incomplete, there is something that opens, not triumphantly, not finally, but steadily, and in the direction of a life that is, slowly and honestly, more fully one's own. In the winter of 1936, Carl Jung sat in his study in Zurich and read the newspapers from Germany with the careful, deliberate attention of a man who had spent his life learning to look at things most people preferred not to see. The reports were political, the explanations offered were political, but Jung, holding the pages in the cold morning light, was reaching for something older than politics, something that moved beneath the economic grievances and the wounded national pride and the charismatic voice that had given the crowd a place to put its fury. He was not dismissing the political analysis. He was asking whether it was sufficient. Whether the vocabulary of policy and resentment and historical circumstance could fully account for what he was watching, the spectacle of an entire civilization surrendering itself to something it could not name and did not understand. What he reached for was the word Watan. It was not a casual choice. Watan was the old Germanic god of storm and frenzy, of ecstatic possession and unconscious compulsion, a figure who had not disappeared from the European psyche simply because Christianity had arrived and given the continent a different theology. Jung had spent decades arguing that what is suppressed does not disappear. It waits, it accumulates, and when it finally moves, it moves with the force of everything that has been held back for centuries. The essay he was forming in his mind would argue that what was happening in Germany was not merely a political phenomenon, but a psychic one, that a people, shaped by centuries of a civilization that prized reason and order and the suppression of instinct, had become the vessel for the return of everything that civilization had refused to carry consciously. He wrote the word at the top of a page. He paused. Outside, the winter was quiet. Somewhere in that quiet, beyond the Alps, something was moving that he had been watching for years and that he still could not entirely explain, only name. The naming was itself a form of care. Jung had arrived at this moment through a long interior history, through years of sitting with patience and with his own unconscious, through the slow construction of a framework that understood the psyche not as a clean container of rational thought, but as a layered structure, most of it below the line of visibility, most of it operating on its own logic, answering to its own needs. He had learned that what individuals suppress does not disappear, but migrates into the body, into dreams, into the behavior of people they cannot stop thinking about. And he had come to believe, in the later decades of his work, that the same logic applied to something larger than the individual. Civilizations, too, have a shadow. The principle at work was one Jung had borrowed from the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus, who had watched the river and concluded that everything contains the seed of its opposite. Heraclitus called it the way things turn. What carries enough heat eventually cools. What bends far enough in one direction eventually swings back. Jung gave this the name enantiodromia, a long, precise word for a simple and relentless phenomenon. Any force carried to its extreme tends to become the thing it most opposes. The century of pure reason generates the century of blood and soil. The age of Victorian sexual repression generates the fin de siècle's intoxication with the erotic. The civilization that builds its entire identity on the suppression of instinct accumulates, in the depths of its collective life, a pressure that does not relent. When that pressure finally moves, it does not announce itself clearly. It does not arrive with a philosophical argument. It arrives as weather, as mood, as the strange magnetic pull of a voice that seems to give form to something the crowd has been carrying without knowing it. Jung watched the rallies described in the newspapers and felt he recognized the quality of attention in the crowds, not the attention of people who had been persuaded by arguments, but the attention of people who had been relieved of something, who had been handed a form large enough to contain what they had been carrying alone and in the dark. This was not a comfort to him, it was a diagnosis. The shadow, when it erupts at the level of a civilization, does not erupt quietly. There is an older image for what Jung was describing, one that predates his framework by millennia. In the ancient Hebrew tradition, on the day of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the high priest performed a ritual that had nothing to do with argument or analysis. He brought 2 goats before the congregation. One was sacrificed. The other was allowed to live, but it was not released without ceremony. The priest placed both hands on the living goat's head, and in the hearing of the whole community, confessed over it all the sins, all the wrongdoing, all the accumulated moral weight of the people across the year just past. Then the goat was led out into the wilderness and released, and the community, watching it go, could breathe again. The ritual is usually described as a mechanism for forgiveness, but what it also describes, with a precision that took thousands of years of psychological language to catch up to, is the mechanism of collective displacement. The community gathers its shadow, not the shadow of any one person, but the shared, unnamed, accumulated weight of everything it cannot acknowledge about itself, and places it, through the ceremony of the priest's hands, onto a creature that can carry it away. The goat does not consent. The goat has not done anything. The goat is simply available and visible and different enough from the congregation that the congregation can convince itself the weight truly belongs there. The word for the goat eventually was scapegoat. The word arrived in English and then spread outward, losing the memory of the desert in the priest's hands, becoming a figure of speech so common it is almost invisible. But what the word still carries, if held carefully, is the entire logic of collective shadow displacement. The group that cannot own what is its own, finding a body to carry it, and then treating that body as though it were the source of the evil rather than the destination of the fear. Jung observed this pattern not as a historian observing something finished, but as a clinician recognizing something ongoing. The scapegoating mechanism is not a relic of ancient ritual. It operates wherever a community has accumulated more shadow than it can bear to name, which is to say, it operates everywhere, at every scale, in every age. The targets change, the mechanism does not. The particular cruelty of the scapegoating mechanism is that it intensifies in proportion to the pressure it is trying to relieve. The community that displaces its shadow onto a group does not thereby become lighter, it becomes more rigid. The energy required to maintain the displacement, to keep the story convincing, to prevent the questions that would dissolve it, grows over time rather than diminishing. And the group that has been assigned the shadow does not disappear. It remains as actual human beings remain in the actual world, and the gap between what they are and what they have been made to represent generates a specific kind of violence that has a very long history and no simple end. Jung paid attention to this pattern not to condemn it from a distance, but to understand the interior structure that made it possible. Because what makes mass displacement possible is the same thing that makes individual projection possible. The refusal, prior to all other conditions, to turn the same intensity of attention inward that one directs outward. The crowd in the square is not composed of monsters. It is composed of ordinary people who have not yet done the hardest thing, who have found, in the collective energy of agreement, a way to avoid the quieter, more demanding question of what is actually moving inside themselves. This was, for Jung, the connection between the interior work and the exterior world. Not metaphorical, not approximate, structural. He had noticed in his clinical work that the institutions most likely to accumulate a dense collective shadow were precisely the institutions most committed to an official ideology of absolute goodness. Religious bodies that preached the elimination of sin, revolutionary movements that promised the perfection of society, spiritual communities organized around a charismatic leader who embodied, for the followers, an ideal of enlightenment so complete it left no room for ordinary human darkness. The very absoluteness of the ideal made honest self-examination impossible, because to examine honestly would be to undermine the claim upon which the entire edifice rested. What cannot be examined does not dissolve. It accumulates in the spaces below the official story, in the record rooms, in the private correspondence that is never shared, in the late hours when the official language is no longer required and something else speaks in its place. The institutions of absolute purity do not thereby become pure. They become the sites of a particular concentrated form of shadow that, when it finally surfaces, carries the additional weight of everything that was required to suppress it for so long. Jung was not surprised by this. He expected it. He had come to understand that the shadow's density is proportional to the idealization that generates it, that the brighter and more rigid the persona, whether individual or institutional, the heavier the accumulation beneath it. What Jung could not have fully anticipated, because it arrived after his most active years, was the specific form this logic would take in the courtroom of Jerusalem in 1961. A man sat in a glass booth and spoke for weeks in the precise, ordered language of administrative procedure. He had coordinated the logistics of mass murder, and his defense was essentially this: that he had been following orders, that he had been doing his job, that the categories of judgment available to him had been institutional rather than moral, and that he had applied them with efficiency and without exceptional cruelty. He was, in the language of ordinary life, not a monster, he was a bureaucrat. The philosopher Hannah Arendt sat in the gallery and watched him, and what she saw disturbed her more than a monster would have. Because a monster is a category. A monster stands outside the ordinary range of human behavior and can therefore be cordoned off, explained as an aberration, contained within the special vocabulary of evil. That Four Adast saw in the glass booth was something harder to contain. She saw the specific emptiness of a man who had replaced the faculty of independent moral thought with the grammar of compliance, who had, through years of submission to a system's logic, evacuated from his interior life precisely the capacity for self-examination that makes a human being capable of saying no. She called it the banality of evil, not because the evil was small, because the structure that produced it was ordinary, available, recognizable in the thousand smaller daily acts of not thinking, not questioning, not turning the light of honest attention onto what one is actually doing and why. Jung would have recognized the structure. In his framework, what Arendt was describing was shadow possession at the level of the social individual, the state in which a person has so thoroughly surrendered the interior life to the demands of an exterior system that the shadow, having nowhere else to go, nowhere to be seen and named and owned, simply operates without restraint through the automated machinery of compliance. The result is not the dramatic eruption of a recognizable monster. It is the quiet, bureaucratic efficiency of a man who has lost the thread back to himself and does not know it. Arendt and Jung arrived at this convergence from very different directions. She was a political philosopher working from the specific facts of a specific trial. He was a depth psychologist working from the patterns of the unconscious life. Neither would have claimed the other's framework as their own, but the shape they were describing, the evacuated interiority, the automated compliance, the specific danger of a self from which the capacity for moral self-examination has been removed, that shape was the same, and it was not, in either of their accounts, a shape that belonged only to the extraordinary circumstances of totalitarianism. That was the point that made Arendt's phrase so difficult for people to hear. The conditions she was describing were not alien, they were structural, available in any system large enough and rigid enough to provide the individual with a complete grammar of behavior that makes interior questioning feel not just unnecessary, but slightly treasonous. The question both of them were circling, without quite arriving at it in identical terms, was this: what would be required at the level of the individual to resist the pull of such systems from the inside? And the answer approached from Jung's direction was precisely the thing shadow work produces. Not the dramatic heroism of a single defiant moment, but the slower, quieter, more daily habit of honest self-examination that keeps the interior life present, active, and capable of disagreement. This is why Jung understood the inner work, not as a retreat from the world, but as one of the most serious contributions an individual could make to it. The connection is not comfortable to hold. It would be easier to think of shadow work as a form of self-improvement, as something undertaken for the sake of the individual's own well-being, separate from the larger questions of collective life. And it is that, in part. But Jung's framework insists on the continuity between the interior and the exterior, insists that what accumulates unchecked in the individual's psyche does not stay there, that it moves into relationships and institutions and political life with the full weight of everything that was refused examination. The inverse is also true. What is examined does not thereby cease to exist. The shadow that is known does not disappear, but it loses the autonomy that comes from invisibility. It can be held, it can be worked with. It does not vanish into the crowd's anger, does not find its way onto the nearest available vessel and demand that vessel carry what belongs, by right of origin, to the one who placed it there. The person who has done even some of this work, who has sat with the uncomfortable question, who has noticed the heat of a strong judgment and wondered what, beneath the certainty it is pointing toward, that person is less available as a carrier of collective projection, less likely to surrender the interior life to a system's grammar, not immune, not finished, but slightly less automatic, slightly more present to themselves in the daily moments when the choice is made and not made. It is a quiet resistance. It does not look like resistance from the outside. It looks like nothing from the outside. It is a person somewhere in the middle of an ordinary evening, choosing not to move away from a difficult question, choosing to stay with it a little longer, choosing to bring the same honest attention to their own interior that they would, if pressed, agree the world requires. Jung believed this was not nothing. He believed it was, in the long mathematics of collective life, a form of care, not the only form, not a substitute for the political and institutional and structural work that the world also requires, but real, consequential in the quiet way that most real things are consequential, not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily, across the years of a life lived with somewhat more honesty than the day before. He had learned this slowly. He had not arrived at it by argument, though the arguments were there. He had arrived at it through his own interior work, through the years of sitting with the imagery arising from his own unconscious, through the confrontation with the figures that appeared in that imagery and that did not flatter him, through the slow and demanding practice of seeing himself with something closer to accuracy than comfort. He had found, at the far end of that process, not a perfected self, but a slightly more honest one, a self capable of holding its own shadow without being overthrown by it. And he had found, too, that this was enough to matter, not to solve everything, but to change, in small and lasting ways, the quality of his presence in the world. The essay on Wotan was published in 1936. It was not widely read at the time. It was too strange in its vocabulary for the political commentators, and too specific in its historical claims for the purely clinical audience. It sat between the available categories, as Jung often did, and waited, What it described did not wait. The years that followed brought everything Jung had feared and more. The collective shadow that had been accumulating across the long suppression of the Western rationalist project erupted with a completeness and a violence that left the century permanently changed. The aftermath of it, the long moral reckoning, the effort to understand how ordinary people had participated in extraordinary harm, the creation of institutions designed to prevent the recurrence, was itself a form of collective shadow work, imperfect, incomplete, ongoing. It is still ongoing. The Yom Kippur ceremony is still performed each year in synagogues across the world without the goat, but with the same essential gesture, a community stopping in the middle of its ordinary life to ask what it has been carrying without acknowledgement, and to bring that carrying into the light where it can be seen. Not to resolve it in a single ceremony, not to believe that the naming is the end, but to make the habit of honesty a recurring practice rather than an emergency response. Jung would have recognized this. He would have recognized this. He would have recognized in the liturgical structure of the ritual the same logic he prescribed for the individual, the regular return to what has been avoided, the patient re-examination of what has been tidied away, the understanding that wholeness is not a destination but a direction, and that moving in the direction, however slowly, is itself the thing that matters. There is something in this recognition that is quietly freeing, even as it makes demands. The shadow is not a problem unique to any individual, any institution, any nation, any age. It is the structural cost of the specific kind of consciousness human beings have, the consciousness that creates selves and societies and civilizations and ideals, and in creating all of these, necessarily leaves something out. The something that is left out does not stay out. It finds its way back in the forms available to it, wearing whatever face the particular moment makes possible. To know this is not to despair of the project. It is to be honest about its conditions. The civilizations that have looked most honestly at this have not been the ones that achieved the greatest purity. They have been the ones that built into their structure some form of regular acknowledgement, some ritual, some practice, some institutionalized habit of turning toward what might otherwise be denied. The shadow cannot be eliminated, but it can be made somewhat more visible. The making visible is its own form of safety. In one of the images Jung returned to late in his life, one of the symbols he had encountered across many traditions and had come to understand as a diagram of the psyche's deepest aspiration, was the mandala. The circular form, symmetrically organized, drawing everything into a single contained wholeness that is not the absence of tension, but the holding of it, not the resolution of opposites, but their patient coexistence within a structure large enough to contain both. He had first encountered the mandala form in the dreams of his patients, arising spontaneously in the imagery of people who had no knowledge of its cultural or religious history. He had drawn them himself during the years of his most difficult interior work. He had found in traditions across the world the same circular form appearing and reappearing in the rose windows of medieval cathedrals, in the sand paintings of Navajo ceremony, in the yantra images of Hindu meditation, in the Chinese cosmological diagrams he had studied with the sinologist Richard Wilhelm. Every tradition had arrived, through its own path, at the same geometric answer to the same question: how do you hold everything you are, including the parts that cannot be made comfortable, within a single form that does not exclude anything? The mandala does not say that the darkness disappears. It says that the darkness has a place within the whole, that it is not the opposite of the light, but its counterpart, that the circle is not complete without both, This is what Jung meant when he spoke of the asterisk conjunctio oppositorum asterisk, the union of opposites, as the telos of the psychological life. Not the victory of light over darkness, not the purging of the shadow in favor of the ideal, but the slow, patient work of bringing both into a single held awareness, where neither can operate without the knowledge of the other. It is a demanding image. It asks more than the simpler stories do, the stories in which the hero destroys the monster and comes home cleansed, in which the civilization achieves the promised purity and the shadow is finally permanently overcome. The harder and more honest story is the one the mandala tells, that the center holds not by excluding the dark, but by knowing where it is, by keeping the relationship between the light and the shadow conscious, active, and ongoing, by refusing the comfort of a wholeness that is purchased by pretending something is not there. Jung spent the last years of his life at Bollingen, in the tower he had built with his own hands at the edge of Lake Zurich, carving symbols into the stone walls, tending the garden, writing and thinking, and staying close to the water. The tower was itself a kind of mandala, a structure he had built to hold everything he had become, the parts that fit the professional world and the parts that did not. The man the century had made of him and the older, stranger self he had been carrying since childhood. He worked with the stone personally, cutting the inscriptions with his own hands, because he wanted the structure to have his mark in it, wanted the making of it to be slow enough that it could hold more than he could plan for. He lived to 85. He had, by any measure, lived with the questions more consistently and more honestly than most. He had found the shadow not as an enemy, but as a companion, difficult, demanding, occasionally alarming, but real, and therefore finally preferable to the cleaner but emptier alternative of a life from which it had been successfully excluded. The alternative was not actually cleaner. He knew this. The life from which the shadow has been successfully excluded is not purer, it is more dangerous, because what has been excluded still moves, still acts, still shapes the behavior of the person or the institution or the civilization, but now without oversight, without the moderating pressure of being known. The shadow that operates in the dark operates without limit. This is the thing Jung had been saying, from the clinical studies of his early career to the cultural observations of his late work, in patient and varied repetition across 50 years of writing. The darkness does not become harmless when it is unseen. It becomes autonomous. And autonomy, in the shadow's case, is the condition that produces the worst of what history records. The light he was asking for was not the light that eliminates the dark. It was the smaller, steadier light of honest attention, the lamp held close to what is actually there, without flinching and without inflating, with the patience of someone who understands that seeing accurately, even when what is seen is uncomfortable, is already the beginning of something better than looking away. Outside the winter window in Zurich, in the early weeks of 1936, the world was moving in a direction that would take years to fully arrive at.